Hi, my name is Mariam. Today we're going to take a look at the fifth and final chapter of the 0470 history syllabus, which is how successful were U.S. attempts to contain the spread of communism. So, as previously mentioned, American foreign policy was during the mid 20th century was largely influenced by the need to contain communism within the within the East. So America, especially, and keep it out of countries where America's interests lay, specifically Cuba and South Korea. So let's take a look. So President Harry Truman wished to implement containment policy in East Asia, specifically South Korea. He knew that American intervention would look better if it was based by the UN. The Korean War ensued, as North Korea had been liberated by the USSR after World War II, while South Korea had been liberated by the USA. The USSR was communist and the USA was capitalist or run by democracy. And both ideologies fundamentally opposed each other. North Korea thus was ruled by a communist Kim Il-sung, and the South was ruled by Syngman Rhee. The North invaded the South in 1950. At this point, China, North Korea were communist nations, and South Korea was next to fall. Truman believed in domino theory. He saw countries in Asia fall one by one to communism, so he immediately sent advisors, supplies, and warships to defend South Korea from what he felt was the spread of communism. Truman put pressure on the UN Security Council to, one, condemn North Korea for invading South Korea, and two, call them to withdraw. Usually, the USSR would exercise its right of veto, but it was boycotting the UN at this time and thus was not present. It was not present. The UN Resolution 84 would lead to the Korean War. And he would claim that actually the Korean War was led by the UN and not specifically by the US. Consequences of the Korean War. 4 million Korean civilians died. The US proved that it had the will and the means to contain communism. It pursued an aggressive foreign policy by contributing to 90% of air forces and 85% of naval forces. It also showed the limits of containment policy. So while the US had effectively stopped North Korea from turning South Korea communist, the US accepted North Korea to be a communist nation. It refused to carry on past the 38th parallel and to completely drive communism out of Asia. Invading North Korea would have brought the USSR and China into the war and escalate things barely a decade after World War II had ended. The Cuban Missile Crisis took place between the 16th and the 18th of October 1961, and it was characterized by heightening USA-USSR tensions. The USA initially placed short-range missiles in Turkey, pointed at the USSR. Communist Cuba, which was close to the American sphere of influence, allowed the USSR to place missiles on it, threatening the USA. The threat of mutually assured destruction, MAD, was present, and it was caused by superpower tension. The Americans and the Soviets were at this point in time in an arms race, with both sides trying to steal technological secrets from each other. The USSR used spies, the USA used high-tech U-2 planes. The nuclear deterrent meant that the enemy would not attack first, as it ensured the other would strike before the bombs landed, leading to MAD. Fidel Castro's Cuba. Cuba was 160 kilometers away from the USA and within the American sphere of influence. Cuban exiles formed powerful pressure groups in the USA, demanding that 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 Harry Truman be deposed. Castro demanding that Fidel Castro be deposed. Castro had taken over American businesses in Cuba and distributed land to the peasants. The Cuban Missile Crisis would be exacerbated by the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion took place on June 1960. President Eisenhower commissioned the USA to damage Cuban sugar plantations. He ensured American businesses refused to cooperate with any Cuban businesses that dealt with the USSR. Castro had a mixed response. He, one, assured Americans in Cuba that they were safe. He allowed the US to keep its naval base there. In 1960, he allied with the USSR, signing a $100 million trade deal with Mikhail Khrushchev. American spies saw him receiving arms from the Soviets as well. By January 1961, President Kennedy could not tolerate a Soviet satellite in America's backyard. He funded Cuban exiles, training them with the CIA and funding them with American air power. A failed invasion took place in the Bay of Pigs. The invasion saw 220,000 troops meet the 1,400 anti-Castro exiles. Castro captured or killed all of them with tanks and modern weapons within a few days. The Bay of Pigs invasion failed in its mission to displace Fidel Castro and Cuban communism. For one, there was a lack of secrecy, so the American government could not deny its involvement. Insufficient Spanish-speaking staff on the American side, failure to organize resistance in Cuba, and there were also poor links between U.S. departments. This led to several effects. The half-hearted invasion made Kennedy seem weak compared to the USSR. Castro and Khrushchev grew very suspicious of the Americans, and the fiasco strengthened Castro in his position as a firm leader of Cuba. By September 1962, Cuba had thousands of Soviet missiles, tanks, technicians, and patrol boats. On the 11th of September, Kennedy warned the USA that he would stop Cuba from becoming a missile military base, and the USSR warned him not to do so. On the 14th of October, an American spy plane flew over Cuba and took pictures of missile sites being built. It was said that in 7 days, the USSR would be ready to launch missiles. Why did Khrushchev place missiles on Cuba? He did so to, one, test the USA to see if they would back off or face up. And two, would they try to contain the spread of communism now? He also wanted to defend Cuba in an American sphere of influence. Cuba was in Uncle Sam's backyard. This was perfect Soviet propaganda if they were to succeed. Cuba was the only communist state in the Western Hemisphere, so it was vital that it be protected. And lastly, he placed missiles on Cuba to strengthen his own position in the USSR. The technical superiority of American missiles undermined his credibility at Moscow. Khrushchev wanted to portray the USSR as a real threat to American world domination. The long-term outcomes of the October crisis was that permanent hotlines were established between the White House and the Kremlin. In 1963, a nuclear test ban treaty was signed to limit nuclear tests. Outcomes of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You could say it was a success for the USA. Kennedy emerged with a better reputation for having stood up to Khrushchev. Kennedy resisted American hardliners who wanted to invade Cuba. Such intervention was not worth the risk of war. But it could also be seen as a failure on the USA's part because the US was criticized by its allies. Newspapers in Britain called out the hypocrisy in objecting to missiles in Cuba while stationing them simultaneously in Turkey. Kennedy had to accept Cuba also as a communist state. So the limits of containment policy were clearly drawn out by this point. Outcomes for the USSR. It was a success. Khrushchev highlighted himself as a responsible peacemaker for making the first move towards peace. Cuba was kept safe. It was a valuable USSR ally and a base for communists in South America. However, the USSR lagged behind in the arms race. It stockpiled ICBMs at a huge cost but never caught up to the USA. Khrushchev was also forced to back down. Military leaders were upset with the terms. They were forced to put missiles on the decks of their ships for the Americans to count, which they found humiliating. So this is like an overview of the October crisis. So on the 16th of October, Kennedy is informed of the missile buildup. By the 23rd of October, Kennedy receives a letter from Khrushchev saying that Soviet ships would not observe the blockade. He does not mention the presence of nuclear missiles on Cuba. The next day, Soviet ships turned around. Aerial photography reveals that there's a rapid development of missile bases in Cuba. By the 27th of October, a second letter is sent to Kennedy revealing that the conditions for removing the missiles was that the USA had to withdraw Turkish missiles. An American U-2 plane is shot down over Cuba, and Kennedy is advised to conduct a reprisal attack. He decides to delay an attack and says that if the USSR did not withdraw, an attack would follow. On the 28th of October, Khrushchev sends another letter agreeing to return the missiles to the Soviet Union. The Vietnam War, another key example of how containment theory was put into action. President Eisenhower was convinced that China and the USSR were planning to spread communism in the East. Domino theory stated that if Vietnam fell to communism, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, and India were next. From 1949, the French attempted to rule Vietnam again. The US supplied 500 million into making sure this took place. In 1954, the US applied a rule that prevented free elections from taking place. They had once criticized Stalin for not holding free elections in the Soviet Eastern Europe post-World War II. So, what were the causes of the Vietnam War? Firstly, US support for Diem. He was an unpopular, he had very anti-Buddhist beliefs. He was a Christian who was part of the landlord class corrupt regime. The Americans helped Diem set up South Vietnam and supported him with $1.6 billion in the 1950s. He was replaced by an equally corrupted and American-backed government after 1963. Secondly, the Viet Cong saw a resurgence. The unpopularity of anti-communist governments led to the National Front that included South Vietnamese opponents and North Vietnamese soldiers acting on Ho Chi Minh's orders. Those who did not join faced violence and intimidation. The South government's strategic hamlet moved peasant villages to their territory. Officials pocketed American money that was meant for supplies. Lastly, a new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, wanted the US to commit all the way to containment. Tonkin Gulf Resolution took place in August of 1964. North Vietnamese patrol boats opened fire on US ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which gave Johnson the power to take the US into a full-scale war. Operation Resolution Thunder was a giant bombing campaign against North Vietnam's factories, cities, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail. On March 8, 3,500 Marines and combat troops landed in Da Nang. The tactics and technology of both sides. So the Viet Cong took part in guerrilla warfare. Its attacks were characterized by hit and run raids. They did not wear official uniforms, so it was hard to identify and tell them apart. 11% of American soldier casualties were due to booby traps. 51% were due to hand-to-hand combat or ambushes. To civilians, fighters were courteous and respectful. They even helped peasants in the fields during busy times. However, they were also prepared to ruthlessly kill those who opposed them. They conducted a campaign of terror against South Vietnamese teachers, police, and tax collectors. 27,000 civilian casualties from 1966 to 71. Supplies. They were dependent on supplies from North Vietnam sent on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was continuously bombed, but 40,000 worked to keep it open. Also, their commitment was commendable. The total dead of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese people was 1 million, but they refused to give in. Okay, the USA. The USA mainly took part in bombing campaigns. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was bombed, as well as North Vietnamese civilian, industrial, and military targets. Bombing worked. It damaged the war effort, it disrupted supply routes, and it forced peace negotiations in 1972. But also, bombing did not work. It could not defeat the communists. Even after major air raids, civilian casualties turned the Vietnamese against them. American soldiers took part in search and destroy missions. These were used to combat guerrilla warfare. Helicopters would descend on a village, search out and destroy any Viet Cong forces. This made them hugely unpopular because innocent villagers were killed, and experienced soldiers also walked into booby traps. Chemical weaponry. 82 liters of Agent Orange, a toxic weed killer, was sprayed from planes to destroy jungle hiding places. Napalm could burn through skin to the bone. From 1967, the average age of troops was 19 years old, and many were inexperienced. Conscripts knew very little about Vietnam and did not care much about democracy or containing communism. So morale was low, and it led to a 1 year term of service. This would backfire because soldiers would gain experience before being sent home. The Tet Offensive took part on New Year's Day in 1968. 4,500 Viet Cong held down a larger US and South Vietnamese force in Saigon. Over 100 cities and military targets were attacked. This turned out to be a major failure for the Viet Cong because over 10,000 fighters died. The civilians of the South Vietnam did not join them as they had initially anticipated. A peace movement soon followed. The Tet Offensive raised questions on US involvement. Nearly 500,000 troops were stationed there, and $20 billion funded the war per annum. The city of Hue was destroyed, and many civilians perished in the process of recapturing towns. So, despite despite the amount of money and being funneled into the war effort, the men and the money could not end the war and contain communism. So, was it all futile? Anti-war sentiment was soon on the horizon for a plethora of reasons. For one, the cost of war. The war cost $20 billion per annum. Inequality, 30% of African Americans were drafted. Muhammad Ali refused to take part. Only 19%, in contrast, of white Americans fought. The purpose of the war showed that violence was being done against children, many of whom were burned by napalm. Napalm Girl became a symbol of civilian cruelty in Vietnam. In November of 1969, there were over 700,000 anti-war protesters in Washington, D.C. Chants like, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" ruined popularity. The My Lai Massacre. It took part on the 16th of March, 1968. Charlie Company was a U.S. division on a search and destroy mission in My Lai village. The village supposedly held 200 fighters, but between 300 to 400 peasants were killed, mostly women, children, and the elderly. The massacre received widespread attention in America and would be the final nail in the coffin of U.S. containment policy. It raised hard questions on the purpose and the direction of the war. The war ended due to the Tet Offensive, the My Lai Massacre, but also the election of Richard Nixon, who deferred in LBJ and wanted to pull the US out of the Vietnam War. The war affected containment in three ways. For one, it showed that even the USA, the world's #1 superpower, could not contain the spread of communism. It also increased the domino effect instead of decreasing it because more countries became communist. It was also a propaganda disaster as the USA showed that it conceded to communism and accepted the communist influence in Asia. Thank you for watching.